What do you think of when you think of power? Obviously, it depends on the context. The dictionary tells us the word can be used as a noun, a verb, an adjective, or as part of a verb phrase. 31 distinct definitions and variations. It gives these corresponding examples as well as many others. Everyone has the power to better themselves. Atomic energy powers the new submarines, cars with power brakes and power windows, and to power on or off a computer. Now, some sermon topics appear in my consciousness like a stray puppy who runs up and asks to be noticed and petted. Others, like a Great Dane that bounds toward me, pounces, and knocks me over. Often, when those of us who write sermons sit down and begin, we are greeted with a theme like lives of the Spirit or future visions, future selves. We sometimes have a civic or religious holiday to acknowledge, like Mother's Day, Hanukkah, or Christmas. We occasionally have a recent local or national tragedy to mourn, like 9/11 or the all too frequent school shooting. Of course, none of those were on the docket for this week, but a series of events made the title, if not the gist of the sermon, unavoidable. In the early morning hours after I last preached, Beryl hit. The most powerful reaction I've ever had to one of my sermons. Like for many of you, the power in my condo, power as in definition number 17, a particular form of mechanical or physical energy, went out. A little over a week later, the afternoon before I was to leave on a trip, the power came back on so I could do laundry and pack. The next day, I flew to Denver to attend the Southwest Industrial Areas Foundation, IAF, training, which focused on organizing community power, and where we were told power is the ability to act. So it seemed to me that the muses were delivering a sermon topic into my lap, or onto my laptop as it were, and address it I must. What to say about something with so many different definitions and connotations? Well, surely I should reference theology somewhere. I admit, having been brought up Methodist as a child, I first thought of that old hymn of substitutionary atonement, "There is power in the blood," a rousing hymn whose theology and imagery I abandoned back in my youth. Then I learned powers also refers to a specific order of angels in Christian theology. They are described in the etymologies of Isidore of Seville from the early 600s, and which I'm sure you've read. The powers are given their name because they are angels who have power over evil forces, which the angels are able to restrain to keep them from doing harm. Powers also oversee the power which human beings, such as kings, have been given in the world. Sort of how the checks and balances of our system of government were originally intended to work. Now, because Earl likes it when I reference mathematics in a sermon, I must point out this usage. The product obtained by multiplying a quantity by itself one or more times, such as the third power of 2 is 8. I'm sure you've heard the aphorism, "knowledge is power," a phrase attributed to Francis Bacon and often used by Thomas Jefferson. A phrase the cynical part of me can't help but think of when I hear of school voucher schemes and eliminating libraries from low-income schools. I also think of superheroes when powers are mentioned. The Mighty Morphin Power Rangers existed as much to merchandise toys as to fight crime. I enjoyed watching the Powerpuff Girls on the Cartoon Network, because of course I did. Blossom, Bubbles, and Buttercup are 3 kindergarten-aged girls with superpowers. The mayor of Townsville often calls on them to use their powers to help fight nearby criminals and other enemies. Power can be employed by individuals, like Power Girl, Superman's buxom cousin who inhabits the DC Comics multiverse. It can also be employed by groups, like the superhero team Power Pack, 4 young siblings in the Marvel universe. Now, my training in Denver was about creating relational power with groups of people to get civic issues dealt with. But what about those things we have the power to do on our own? Over 160 years ago, Henry David Thoreau wrote, "There will never be a really free and enlightened state until the state comes to recognize the individual as a higher and independent power, from which all its own power and authority are derived, and treats him accordingly." I really don't think they've learned that yet. As I was thinking of an individual claiming their power, I thought of a photograph by Jeff Widener from his hotel room near Tiananmen Square on June 4th, 1989. As a column of tanks rolled by, a man carrying shopping bags stepped in front of them. I assume he thinks he's going to die, remembers Widener. But he doesn't care because, for whatever reason, either he's lost a loved one or he's just had it with the government, or whatever it is, his statement is more important than his own life. But I'm going to focus on individual power that's a bit more personal and less death-defying. I again return to the quote I've often used by the South African Anglican bishop and theologian Desmond Tutu. There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. I've shared this quote before when I've talked about the importance of both our community projects team and our Justice Coordinating Council. The community projects team does the important work of pulling people out of the water, collecting clothing, food, and toiletries for the underserved in our community. The Justice Coordinating Council goes upstream to find out why they're falling in, why so many are unable to get clothing, food, and toiletries, and asking why the poverty rate in Harris County is almost 16%. UUs have got both ends of the stream covered. And today I'm going to include our care team, plus the new group that I am creating called the Pastoral Partners. It only takes 2 to create power. In the book Power Over Power by David Nyberg, he points out, whenever at least 2 people are related in some way relevant to at least one intended action, power is present as a facet of that relationship. The minimum and necessary conditions of power are 2 people and 1 plan for action. That intended action can be taking someone who no longer drives to an appointment, or visiting another church member in the hospital or retirement center. By creating relationships and agreeing on an action, individuals, out of love, create power and influence. Father Richard Rohr, in the preface to Near Occasions of Grace, wrote, "Both love and power are necessary building blocks of God's powerful realm on earth. Love utterly redefines the nature of power. Power without love is mere brutality, even in the church. And love without power is only the sentimentality of individual lives disconnected from the whole." You may recognize that echoes the reading from Dr. King that we read earlier. Later he tells us, authentic power is the ability to act from the fullness of who I am. The capacity to establish and maintain a relationship with people and things, and the freedom to give myself away. Much has been said about the potential power and influence of individuals as well as when those individuals unite to create influence. I believe this is exemplified by both our ability and responsibility to vote, as well as our ability and responsibility to encourage groups of others to vote. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in his Keep On Moving speech in May of 1963, "There is power in unity and there is power in numbers." The training I attended in Denver was to learn more about community organizing, meaning organizing individuals into groups to claim our power. The Metropolitan Organization, TMO, is the local affiliate of the IAF here in Houston. There were community organizers from all over the western part of the U.S. and Canada, including one UU minister from Omaha and one from Calgary. The training is based on the work of Saul Alinsky, who wrote, "Change comes from power, and power comes from organization." One of his great ideas was to organize people through those organizations they have already affiliated with, like their churches or unions. That way, they could build power and negotiate with the power in the city. I shared the following information at a TMO leadership forum where I had been asked to reflect on one of the readings. This was in February of last year, before my parents had passed. My parents worked hard all their lives, and metaphorically speaking, didn't color outside the lines much. My dad grew up in a house without indoor plumbing. I was the first in our family to go to college. My dad never earned what he would have if the workers at his company had come together and joined a union. The owner ended up selling the company for parts, kicking my dad to the curb after 35 years. My father felt beaten down at work and never felt he had a voice to change things on a large scale. In 1976, professor and theologian Bernard Loomer wrote an essay entitled "Two Conceptions of Power." He distinguished between power over, or unilateral power, and power with, or relational power. He contended the former is the traditional and the latter is what is needed. My father was most familiar with and beaten down by unilateral power. It is top-down, intended to produce an effect on others. Those below are acted on. Relational power, however, is collective, mutual, where we act with, are not acted upon. There is a culture of conversation, and both sides can grow and change. Father Richard Rohr talks about this, but uses slightly different language. Instead of unilateral power and relational power, as we heard earlier, he speaks of power and love. In Mending the Breach, Love and Power, he writes, "Power assumes that life is lived from the top down and from the outside in. It draws its strength from elites and enforcement. As such, it is efficient, clean, practical, and works well on many short-term goals. The gospel offers us the inefficient, not so clean, multi-layered, long-haul way of love. Love is lived much more from the bottom up and from the inside out." It's easy to see why even churches don't believe in it. It does not give ego or institution any sense of control. Often it doesn't even work. Unilateral power is what those who work for their own ends are interested in. Relational power is what community organizing is interested in. Love is what propels our care team, community projects team, and justice coordinating council to engage and lift up others. I heard my dad say several times he couldn't comprehend why any decent person would go into politics. He may have heard Robin Williams' definition of politics. Poly, a Latin word meaning many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking creatures. Dad was never able to join with others to mobilize power in order to influence those politicians. Well, he was hardly alone. A Pew Research report in September of last year relates that just 4% of U.S. adults say the political system is working extremely or very well. Another 23% say it is working somewhat well. About 6 in 10, 63%, express not too much or no confidence at all in the future of the U.S. political system. But if we want our opinions to be heard and our values to be addressed, we must become involved as well. It doesn't do for us to fold our arms and simply refuse to become involved for fear of wading into a cesspool. While I wasn't able to convince my dad of this, power and politics is not always unethical or evil. It is simply using your influence and relationships to address issues important to you. As Dr. King said in our first reading, power properly understood is the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, or economic changes. In this sense, power is not only desirable, but necessary in order to implement the demands of love and justice. It is the cultivation of relationships and influence, so our concerns are heard. When those with values diametrically opposed to ours have those relationships and influence with politicians and elected leaders, we must cultivate them too, so we're not ignored and our values are acknowledged and addressed. Back in June, I lamented how politicians want to post the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms, claiming power by claiming to enforce God's rules, like the Ten Commandments, is nothing new. I compared this to the lack of interest in posting the Beatitudes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where those who are identified as merciful, as peacemakers, and as meek are acknowledged as blessed. I suspect this plays into a misperception that those who stand up for themselves and others aren't nice, and power is only used to further selfish interests. The stories on social media of screaming, nightmarish retail customers reinforce this perception. But power is a tool like a hammer. It can be used to build up or tear down. It depends on who uses it. Dr. King told us, I am not interested in power for power's sake, but I'm interested in power that is moral, that is right, and that is good. The Sermon on the Mount tells us, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. When I hear the word meek, I think of Dorothy describing herself to the wizard. I am Dorothy, the small and meek, because of course I do. While Dorothy may have embodied the dictionary definition of meek, humbly patient or quiet in nature, she was able to use her power, especially in standing up for her friends. When they first met the lion, he bullies the Tin Man and Scarecrow and chases Toto. Dorothy gets angry, slaps him across the nose, and says, "Shame on you." You may have noticed on the news, if not in your actual experience, that cowards bully others until they are held accountable. Later, again in an attempt to save a friend, she throws a bucket of water toward the Scarecrow, and for the second time commits involuntary witch slaughter. As is often the case, when someone gets angry enough, they embrace their power, especially when it affects someone or something they love. While both of her murders of witches were accidental, it was very intentional that she gave up the color and adventure of Oz for the shades of gray and moral ambiguity of Kansas. She loved and missed her family and home and chose to return. When we are acting out of love for ourselves, our friends and family, and the greater good, we are using our power not only appropriately, but necessarily. Another Dorothy Day, wrote, "What we would like to do is change the world. Make it a little simpler for people to feed, clothe, and shelter themselves as God intended them to do. And try fighting for better conditions by crying out unceasingly for the rights of the workers, the poor, of the destitute, the rights of the worthy and unworthy poor." In other words, we can, to a certain extent, change the world. Glinda told Dorothy, "You've always had the power. So do you. Go and use it with love to bring about justice and to help create the beloved community here on earth, here and now." Amen.